powerful CEO was saved by the poor homeless man and didn't know he was an ex-soldier. Helen crumpled to the ground, shaking. Bob turned to her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, breath heavy. She stared at him, stunned. How did you?" Bob helped her sit up gently, his movements surprisingly tender for someone who just incapacitated 3 men. "You learn a few things in the military," he muttered. She blinked, still in disbelief. "Military? You never said." "I don't talk about it. Wasn't exactly discharged with honor." The morning air was sharp, the kind that stung gently against the skin but cleared the mind. The sky wore a moody gray, and the trees in Middleton Park stood like quiet witnesses to the city's chaos. Joggers passed by, earbuds in, lost in their own rhythm. But Helen moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as if she wasn't running from calories but from thoughts that refused to settle. Dressed in sleek black leggings, a designer windbreaker, and spotless white running shoes, Helen didn't exactly blend into the scene. She was the CEO of a fast-rising tech company, but no one would guess how unstable it all felt beneath her polished exterior. Layoffs loomed, investors grew restless, and rumors about the company's fall from grace were swirling louder than ever. Every morning, she ran here, not to escape the noise, but to hear herself think. And every morning, she saw him. Bob. He sat on the same bench, just off the gravel path, tucked beneath a half-dead willow tree that leaned like an old man with secrets. His thick coat was fraying at the edges, the color of overwashed navy, and his hands were usually tucked deep into fingerless gloves. He was black, probably in his 50s, and spoke with a voice that carried both warmth and years of pain. Helen always slowed when she saw him, reaching into the inner pocket of her jacket for a folded 20. "You don't have to keep doing this, ma'am," Bob said one morning, his dark eyes fixed on her with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. "I know," she replied with a small smile, handing him the bill anyway. "But I want to." Bob took it, nodding slowly. "Then I'll keep saying thank you. But don't think I'm just sitting here doing nothing. I got my eyes open." Helen chuckled softly. "What does that mean?" He looked out across the field. "It means not all who sit still are lost." She was taken aback by the depth in his words. She sat beside him, briefly. It became a pattern. Each morning, they'd talk for a few minutes before she continued her run. Their conversations were short, sometimes about the weather, sometimes deeper. "Why do you always come here?" he asked her one foggy Thursday. Helen hesitated, watching a dog chase after a thrown stick. "Because it's the only place where no one expects anything from me." Bob nodded. "That sounds heavy." "Expectations. You have no idea," she whispered. But he did. He didn't tell her about the medals, or the years he'd spent in the service, first as a soldier, later as a trainer. He didn't talk about how the war had followed him home, whispering in the night, stealing his peace. Or about how he lost his family, his home, and eventually himself, drifting until this bench became his anchor. Helen never asked. And Bob never volunteered. Until the day she needed saving. At first glance, Helen Martins looked like she had it all. Founder and CEO of one of the most innovative tech firms in the country, she had graced business magazine covers, spoken at global summits, and survived the kind of boardroom storms that would sink lesser leaders. But what the headlines didn't say was that she was tired. Not of the work, but of the quiet betrayals. The park was her sanctuary. Every morning before sunrise, she'd lace her sneakers and run, not to stay fit, but to breathe before the day's fire began. And every morning, Bob was there. Waiting. Watching. Listening. Inside the high-rise walls of Helix Dynamics, Helen was surrounded by wolves in tailored suits. One of her senior executives, Marcus, had been playing a long game. Slick, brilliant, and charming, he had once been her right-hand man. But in the shadows, he had been leaking intel to a rival company, slowly manipulating data, making key contracts fall through, driving shareholders into doubt. Also, the company's value would plummet enough to be sold off. To Helen, it was like bleeding slowly and being forced to smile while it happened. She suspected something wasn't right. Her gut twisted at the signs, missed deadlines, strange financial holes, whispers that vanished when she entered the room. But it was the loyalty of her core team, like Rita, her communications lead, and Samuel from engineering, that kept her upright. "I know something's wrong," Rita whispered one evening as they stood near the office balcony, city lights winking below them. "He's planting doubts in the board." "I've seen the emails, Helen. You need to act." Helen exhaled deeply, looking out into the city like it might offer her the answers. "If I confront him now without proof, I lose everything." "You're already losing everything," Rita said gently. "We're not all here for the stock options, you know. Some of us believe in you." The word sank into Helen's chest like warm tea against a sore throat. She nodded, but her heart felt heavier than ever. The next morning, as she sat beside Bob on the park bench, her mind ran in circles. She barely spoke. "You look like you're in the middle of a war," Bob said after a long silence. Helen blinked at him, surprised. "I am. But it's not the kind people talk about. It's a war of silence, of smiles and backstabbing. I built this company from scratch, and someone I trusted is selling me out from the inside." Bob nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You trust your people?" "Some of them. But I've been burned," she admitted. He leaned back, folding his arms. "Loyalty is a strange thing. Comes from love. Betrayal, though, that comes from fear or greed. Sounds like you've got both swimming around you." Helen studied him. His words always carried more weight than she expected. "How do you know that?" He gave her a crooked smile. "Let's just say, I've led men in worse wars than this. Seen what greed does to good men. I've watched bullets fly because someone wanted a bigger slice of the pie." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You were in the military?" Bob just looked at her and said nothing. She narrowed her eyes, realizing for the first time that there was a story behind his silence. A story she hadn't been curious enough to ask. That evening, as Helen left the park, her phone buzzed. A message from Rita. Subject, urgent. "Helen, we have proof. Marcus met with someone from Novatech last night. They're planning to move on the buyout next week. We need to move fast." Helen stood frozen beneath a flickering street lamp. The war had finally arrived. And she didn't know it yet, but Bob, the man she thought she was helping, was about to step in and change everything. It happened on a Thursday. Helen had just wrapped a meeting that felt like peeling her own skin. The tension in the boardroom had reached boiling point. Eyes darted, tempers flared, and the air smelled like betrayal. But thanks to Rita and Samuel, she had just exposed Marcus's lies to the board, encrypted communications with Novatech, doctored financials, all of it laid bare. Marcus had remained eerily calm. No shouting. No denials. Just a slow smirk that chilled her more than anything he could have said. He didn't fight back, he just stood, straightened his cuffs, and walked out without a word. That night, Helen decided to take the long route home. She needed the air. The park was quiet. Street lamps flickered. Her heels clicked gently against the stone path. For a moment, she let herself believe it was over. That she'd finally won. Then the van pulled up. She didn't hear it at first. Just the crunch of tires rolling too slow behind her. Then, doors slamming, footsteps rushing. "Hey!" She turned, but it was too late. A hand grabbed her shoulder. Another covered her mouth. She struggled, fought, kicked, but there were 3 of them. Men in black masks. One of them hissed, "Make it look messy. Don't kill her yet." She screamed, but it was swallowed by the trees. That's when she heard it, an angry voice cut through the dark like a blade. "Let her go, Bob." He emerged from the trees like a shadow turned to flesh, bigger than she'd ever realized, body coiled tight like a spring. In his hand was a rusted metal pipe, but in his stance was something far more dangerous. One of the men lunged at him with a knife. Bob ducked. A clean, brutal strike to the ribs. The man dropped. Another tried to blindside him, but Bob was faster. A quick pivot, a twist of the wrist, a broken arm. The last man hesitated. Bob looked at him and said nothing, only his eyes spoke. And whatever they said made the last attacker run. Helen crumpled to the ground, shaking. Bob turned to her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, breath heavy. She stared at him, stunned. How did you?" Bob helped her sit up gently, his movements surprisingly tender for someone who just incapacitated 3 men. "You learn a few things in the military," he muttered. She blinked, still in disbelief. "Military? You never said." "I don't talk about it. Wasn't exactly discharged with honor." Helen looked at him, truly looked for the first time. "What happened?" Bob sighed, the weight of years pressing against his ribs. "I was framed. My unit, something went wrong. A raid overseas. I spoke up when I wasn't supposed to. Said we'd hit a civilian zone. They buried it, and they buried me with it. Dishonorable discharge. Lost everything. Family. Job. Name." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was helping you." "You were," Bob said, finally smiling. "But maybe it wasn't always in the way you thought." They sat there under the cold streetlight, silence stretching like a blanket over their shared grief and fight. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You saved my life." Bob looked out into the dark. "You gave me a reason to remember I still had one." They sat in the silence after the chaos. The park was quiet again, almost eerily so. The soft hum of city lights buzzed faintly in the distance, but here, in the shadows beneath the trees, time slowed. Helen's hands trembled in her lap as she looked at Bob, no longer just the quiet homeless man on the bench, but a soldier. A man who had once worn a uniform, held a rifle, and bore a nation's trust on his shoulders. "Tell me the truth," she said softly. "I want to know everything." Bob hesitated. His jaw tensed like he'd held this story behind clenched teeth for years. "My unit was deployed overseas," he began slowly, eyes locked on the dark path ahead. "Special operations. We were told we were running surveillance missions on high-risk cells in Syria. But it didn't sit right. Intel kept falling into enemy hands, like they knew our steps before we took them." He exhaled sharply, like the memories choked him. "I started digging. And I found something, my commanding officer, Colonel Rourke. He was feeding information to the other side. Selling us out. Leaking details about troop movements, strike locations. Men died because of him. My men." Helen's breath caught. "You tried to report him?" Bob nodded slowly. "I gathered evidence. Took it to internal affairs. Next thing I know, I'm being accused of falsifying reports, hacking restricted comms. They said I was the mole. His voice cracked, rage, pain, and years of held-back truth breaking through. They stripped me of my medals, dishonorably discharged me in front of my family. My wife left. Said she couldn't live with the shame. Friends disappeared. I went from hero to traitor in one day. Helen's chest ached. But why didn't you fight back? Clear your name? I did, he said, almost in a whisper. 4 years. But the system was sewn shut. Rourke had powerful friends. He was promoted. I was erased. Tears welled up in Helen's eyes. She reached out and grabbed his hand. I'm so sorry, Bob. He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, she saw not a broken man, but a man who had survived everything the world tried to kill in him. You believed me when I said I had nothing. But I had something. I had integrity left. And watching you, every day, showing up, fighting through your own kind of war, it reminded me of the person I used to be. Helen's heart swelled with emotion. You said betrayal comes from fear or greed. I see now, you've known both. He nodded. But loyalty still exists. In people like you. People who don't fold. A silence passed between them before Helen stood slowly, her voice steady now. Bob. I don't know how yet. But we're going to make this right. I have influence. Resources. And I've got a company that needs someone exactly like you, someone who knows how to see the truth before it's too late. He blinked, unsure. You'd do that? After all this? She nodded, a new fire lighting her eyes. You saved my life. Let me help restore yours. For the first time in years, Bob smiled fully. Not the polite nod he gave on the bench. A real, soul-deep smile. By morning, the park had become a crime scene. Police sirens echoed faintly as uniformed officers cordoned off the area where Helen had been attacked. The 3 assailants were in custody, bloodied and bruised. One had suffered a broken wrist, the other 2 had been immobilized with precise, professional blows. None of them would forget the man who brought them down. Helen sat on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a gray blanket, eyes distant but burning with resolve. Bob stood nearby, arms crossed, answering questions from a detective. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. Detective Lawson approached her later, flipping through a small notepad. We've interrogated the suspects. One of them cracked. They were hired to make it look like a kidnapping gone wrong. Paid up front in cash. The trail leads back to someone named Marcus Weller. He's on our radar now. Helen's mouth tightened. He used my trust and nearly cost me my life. Lawson nodded. We'll find him. The charges will stick. With what your team uncovered and now this attempted assault, he's finished. Helen looked past the detective to Bob, who was calmly speaking to an officer, telling the same story he had just told her the night before. Detective, she said suddenly, you should know, that man saved my life. He's not just a witness. He's the reason I'm standing here. Lawson followed her gaze. He has military written all over him. Any idea why a man like that's been living on a bench? Helen's voice dropped. He was framed by someone very similar to Marcus. Someone powerful. He never got justice. Lawson nodded slowly, his expression shifting from procedural to personal. Maybe it's time that changed. Weeks later, With Marcus behind bars and a formal investigation exposing layers of corporate espionage, Helen returned to her office a different woman. Her company had nearly crumbled under the weight of betrayal, but it hadn't. Her loyal team, those who had believed in her through every storm, had stood tall beside her. The boardroom felt brighter now. Cleaner. And Bob? Bob was no longer a quiet figure on a park bench. He stood beside her in the executive wing, clean-shaven, well-dressed in a charcoal gray suit, and introduced to her staff as Director of Security and Risk Management. There were whispers at first. Raised eyebrows. But once people heard his story and saw him in action, respect followed quickly. At a press conference held in the company's newly reopened atrium, Helen stood at the podium. "I wouldn't be here today if not for one man," she said, her voice unwavering. "He reminded me that strength doesn't always wear a title, and integrity doesn't need approval. This company is not just rebuilt, it's reborn. And it's going to stand for something better." She turned to Bob and smiled. "Please welcome Mr. Robert King." Bob stepped up slowly, the applause rising to greet him. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. His redemption had begun. Later that night, as the building emptied and city lights glowed against the glass walls, Helen stood by the window sipping tea. Bob walked up beside her. "You ever think you'd be here again?" she asked. He shook his head, smiling. "Didn't think I'd even be seen again." She turned to him. "Now the world's watching. And they finally know the truth." He looked at her, his old wounds, her new strength, and said softly, "Sometimes, you have to lose everything, to find what matters." And for the first time in a long, long while, they both felt free. The morning sun filtered gently through the glass windows of Helen's office, no longer a battleground of politics and betrayal, but a space filled with light and purpose. The old air of suspicion was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable unity. Her staff moved through the halls with new energy. No more second-guessing footsteps. No more holding back truths out of fear. The company had nearly fallen, but now, it stood on stronger legs. Loyal legs. And at its center, Helen had become more than a CEO, she was a leader people trusted again. And beside her, in a tailored black suit with eyes that scanned every shadow, was Bob. But long before his first day as her head of private security, Helen had made a promise to him, a promise she refused to break. "I believe you," she had told him that night. "Now let's prove it." With her resources and influence, she quietly hired one of the most discreet and relentless private investigators in the city, Elena Ward. A former intelligence analyst who had a reputation for finding the truth others buried. It took months. Elena tracked down files hidden in off-the-book storage. She found a former radio technician who had worked during the mission Bob was discharged from, an aging veteran living off-grid who confirmed hearing scrambled comms intercepted by the enemy hours before Bob's unit deployed. Then came a set of tampered field reports, doctored with Rourke's clearance code. Bit by bit, the truth surfaced. And while the investigator hunted down the proof, Helen brought Bob into her inner circle, not out of pity, but because she trusted him more than most people she'd known her entire career. "This place used to feel like a trap," she once told him as he walked her to her car. "Now, it feels like home again. You're a big part of that." Bob only nodded, his face unreadable, but his shoulders lighter than they'd been in years. By the time Elena turned in her final report, a storm had already begun to brew within the military's legal department. The new evidence was undeniable. The media hadn't caught wind yet, but the whispers had started. About a dishonored soldier who might have been the scapegoat for a cover-up. Bob never said it out loud, but one evening, standing on the company's rooftop overlooking the skyline, he turned to Helen and said, "Thank you. Not just for the job, Not for the suit or the second chance. For believing in something no one else would touch. Helen met his eyes. You believed in me first. I was just returning the favor. 1 year later. The air was crisper. Cleaner. Bob stood at attention in a quiet courtroom as the military tribunal delivered their ruling. His record would be cleared. His name would be restored. And though they could never give back the years he lost, they offered something more powerful. A public apology. Helen sat in the front row, eyes glassy with pride. Later that night, back at her office, her staff surprised her with a celebration, not just for the company's soaring growth, but for surviving it all. Bob stood by her side, glass in hand, watching the people he once observed from the shadows now smiling, laughing, believing. In a world full of betrayal, she had found people who were loyal. And he had found, at long last, a reason to stand tall again.